All right. Senator Markwayne Mullin thought this moment would never come. For months, the story of his overseas travel had been floating through Washington, whispered in hallways, buried in committee briefings, passed around in classified summaries that most Americans never see. Then Senator Gary Peters sat down across from him at a hearing table, opened a folder, and said 4 words that changed the entire atmosphere in that room. "You're under oath now." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but that second told you everything. Because Mullin knew exactly what was inside that folder, and Peters knew that Mullin knew. What happened next is the exchange that Washington has been trying to process ever since. This isn't about party politics. This isn't about who you voted for. This is about a sitting United States senator who traveled overseas under circumstances that raised serious questions, and another senator who sat across from him with documents in hand and demanded answers. And when you understand what those documents showed, when you see exactly what Peters was pressing him on, you'll realize why this hearing was different from every other political confrontation you've watched this year. So what actually happened? One trip, one set of records, one moment under oath, where the carefully constructed explanation started showing cracks. Let me take you back to where this story actually begins. Because the exchange you're about to understand didn't start in that hearing room. It started much earlier, in a decision Mullin made that bypassed the normal channels. The notifications, the security briefings, the interagency coordination that is supposed to govern overseas travel by sitting members of the United States Senate. When a senator travels abroad, especially to a region with active security concerns, the process is not optional. There are protocols. There are notifications that have to be made to specific agencies. There are logistical chains that exist precisely because a U.S. senator on foreign soil is not just a private citizen. They carry information. They carry access. They carry the weight of their office into every room they enter. Mullin traveled anyway. And the way he traveled, the timing, the communication, or lack of it, the route, the people he was in contact with, all of it became the subject of a serious inquiry. Because when that information surfaced, when the paper trail started emerging, the story Mullin had been telling publicly didn't match what the records were showing privately. That gap is what Peters walked into that hearing room to close. Peters didn't come in loud. That's the first thing you need to understand about how this exchange unfolded. He came in quiet, measured, the kind of quiet that experienced political observers immediately recognize as dangerous. Because loud senators make noise. Quiet senators with documents make records. And Peters had the documents. He started with the easy questions. Foundation-laying questions. When did you decide to make this trip? Who did you notify before you left? What was the stated purpose? Standard stuff. The kind of questions that seem almost routine until you realize they're building a timeline. And the timeline matters because timelines can be checked. Timelines can be cross-referenced against flight records, communication logs, agency notifications, and the testimony of every other person who was supposed to be in the loop. Mullin answered, carefully, with the confidence of someone who had given versions of this answer before. He leaned into the explanation he had already road-tested in less formal settings. The trip was necessary. The situation on the ground required it. He was trying to help. He made the calls he thought were appropriate. It sounded reasonable. It was designed to sound reasonable. But Peters wasn't listening for tone. He was listening for specific words that could be placed next to specific documents. And that's when the hearing shifted. Peters placed the first document on the table. Not dramatically, not with a flourish. He just slid it across and said calmly, "I'd like you to look at this." The room didn't go loud. It went the other kind. The kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes the conversation has changed levels. Because what that document showed was a communication log, a record of what notifications had been made, and more importantly, what notifications had not been made, in the window before Mullin's travel commenced. And here's the thing about communication logs. They don't care about intent. They don't care about what you meant to do. They show timestamps. They show who sent what to whom and when. And the timestamps in that document did not align with what Mullin had just described. Not dramatically, but in a way that created a gap. A small, specific, documentable gap between the timeline he had placed on the record and the timeline that the records themselves showed. Peters looked at him. "Can you explain the discrepancy?" Mullin paused. Not long, but long enough. What followed was a back and forth that analysts have been dissecting since the transcript dropped. Because Mullin's response to that document was careful in a way that made things more complicated, not less. He didn't deny the document. He couldn't. It was right there on the table. Instead, he reframed, he offered context. He suggested that the notification process was more informal than the document implied, that certain communications happened through channels that wouldn't appear in the official log, that the agencies understood the nature of the trip even if the formal paperwork didn't fully reflect it. It was a sophisticated answer, the answer of someone who had thought hard about how to handle exactly this question. But sophisticated answers to document-based questions create their own problem, because now Peters had something better than a simple contradiction. He had a witness who had committed under oath to a specific alternative explanation, an explanation that could be tested against every other piece of evidence in the file, an explanation that other witnesses would now have to either confirm or contradict. That's the trap, and Mullin walked into it carefully, which somehow made it worse. Here's what nobody in the media coverage explained clearly. The overseas travel question was never just about the trip itself. The trip was the surface. What Peters was building toward was the deeper question. What was a sitting senator doing in a sensitive region with what information, in contact with which parties, under what authorization? Because those questions connect to a much larger set of concerns about the boundaries of individual senatorial action in areas that intersect with active U.S. foreign policy operations. A senator is not the executive branch. A senator does not have unilateral authority to conduct foreign policy. When a senator travels to a region where U.S. government equities are actively in play and does so outside the normal coordination structure, the question of who they were talking to becomes a question with serious institutional implications. Peters understood that. The committee understood that. And the reason the room changed temperature when Peters started laying out the document record was because everyone understood that what looked like a question about travel logistics was actually about something much bigger. The second document Peters introduced was the one that made Mullin's team visibly tense. This wasn't a communication log. This was a summary of the briefing materials, the classified briefings that Mullin had received in the weeks before his travel. Briefings that covered, in specific detail, the security environment in the region he traveled to. Briefings that would have made clear to anyone reading them carefully exactly why the coordination requirements existed. Peters' question was precise. Senator, based on the briefings you received, and you did receive these briefings, correct, did you have any reason to believe that your travel might create complications for ongoing operations in that region? Mullin said he relied on his own judgment. Peters didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the document and said, quietly, your own judgment, while under oath. The room didn't erupt. It did something harder to recover from. It went very still. That stillness matters. Because in a Senate hearing, noise is manageable. Noise gets edited into clips. Noise becomes partisan talking points that both sides can spin. Stillness is different. Stillness means the people in that room, the staffers, the other senators, the journalists, the cameras, have all processed the same thing at the same moment. What they processed was the gap between the briefings Mullin received and the decisions he made, the gap between the coordination requirements that existed and the coordination that didn't happen. Peters wasn't calling him a liar. He was doing something more methodical and more lasting. He was building a record of the gap. Sentence by sentence, document by document, answer by answer, all of it locked into the permanent transcript of a formal Senate proceeding. Mullin pushed back. He was forceful. He talked about the urgency of the situation, about the people on the ground who needed help, about the limitations of a process that moves slowly when circumstances demand speed. And there's something real in that argument. There is genuine tension in the American political system between the individual initiative that senators sometimes believe their constitutional role authorizes and the institutional coordination requirements that the intelligence community insists on. Mullin was leaning into the strongest version of his defense, the version where he's not a rogue actor but a responsive official acting on conscience in a broken system. It's a compelling narrative. In a different setting, with different documentation on the table, it might have worked. But Peters had the briefing materials. He had the communication logs, he had the timeline, and he kept bringing Mullin back to those specific documents with that specific phrase, "You're under oath. Answer this right now." Not as a threat, as a procedural reminder. A reminder that the narrative Mullin had constructed for public consumption was now being tested against a documentary record in a formal proceeding, and that every word of his response was becoming part of a permanent record that investigators and future proceedings could access and scrutinize. Here's the uncomfortable truth this hearing forced into the open. The oversight mechanisms that govern how senators operate in sensitive foreign policy spaces are genuinely weak. The coordination requirements that exist are largely norm-based rather than legally enforceable in the immediate term. A senator who decides to travel outside the coordinated system doesn't face automatic legal consequences the way an executive branch official might. The accountability, when it comes through exactly this kind of proceeding. Public, under oath, documented, creating a record that lives in the archive of American governance indefinitely. That's why Peters pressed the way he pressed, not because he expected a confession, but because the record matters. Because the next time a senator's overseas travel becomes a subject of oversight concern, this exchange will be in the file. And the answers Mullin gave, the gaps he couldn't fully close between his account and the documentation, all of it will be there for anyone who needs to understand what happened. Mullin left that hearing having survived it. He didn't collapse, he didn't contradict himself catastrophically, he gave the kind of testimony that lets supporters say he held his ground and lets critics say he confirmed what they already suspected. But surviving a hearing isn't the same as resolving the questions it raised. The transcript exists now, the documents are in the record, the gap between what Mullin described and what the communication logs showed is a permanent feature of the public archive. And the people who care about oversight don't stop caring because a hearing ended without a dramatic moment. They keep pulling the thread, they keep checking the document record against the sworn testimony, they keep asking whether the explanations hold up when you put them next to everything else. That's how these things actually work, not in a single explosive moment. In the slow, methodical accumulation of documented contradictions that eventually become impossible to explain away. Peters knew that when he sat down. Mullin knew it when he saw the folder. And everyone in that hearing room knew that what they were watching wasn't the end of this story. It was the record being set, and records don't disappear. The next document review is already underway. And when it surfaces, this exchange, these questions, these answers, this oath, will be the foundation it's built on. Stay ready, because this is not over.